Good morning. I like to think that our panel starts at the reasonable hour that we could all sleep in because we do this for a living in games and we tend to be a little more night owls than early morning people. My name is Serena Robar. I'll be moderating our session today with our two fabulous one on one side of the ads formatting and one on the other side. So we've got our consumer and our supplier for that. I'm going to let Dylan and CK introduce themselves a little about what they're as we start. So Dylan, why don't we explore Dylan for a second?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Dylan Umali. I'm a senior business development manager at HyprMX. If you guys aren't familiar with HyprMX, we are an entirely brand-focused network focused on bringing Fortune 500 brands into mobile apps and games.
Welcome.
Hi, my name is CK. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Kooapps. We make mobile games in a hyper-casual space such as Snake.io, Pick the Word, and Stacky Bird. We're about 3 million DAU and growing, and it's been exciting. But of course, there's a lot of things to get right, and we work pretty hard at it. So yeah.
Welcome, excellent. So we spoke earlier, and we were like, "What does everyone want to know about?" And so I'd like to start some questions, and then we'll throw it out to the audience if you guys have anything specific you'd like to ask. A little about. I'll let CW talk first about this, about sort of the changes in the multi-ad that we've seen across for games, like what you've offered before and what you're changing into. Can you speak a little to that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've been around for a while, like 10 years, and so ad formats have changed dramatically. I'd say, industry probably started off with banners, and then interstitial became a big thing, and then RV was sort of 2014, 2015 became really popular. And actually, initially, RV was very unpopular with advertisers because they're like, hey, you're paying people to watch an ad. That's usually like a taboo in terms of advertisers. What they want, real users, loyal users, high quality users. Why am I paying for this? Or why are they receiving coins for watching an ad? But the industry, of course, has come a long way. And I would say, nowadays, interstitials, still bread and butter. I'd say, maybe 50% of a hyper casual, of our revenue of hyper casual games would be in interstitial ads. RV is really good, and when people opt in, the user experience there tends to be really positive. So a lot of game developers that really care about user experience will skew higher on RV and less on interstitials, for example. And so RV is really big, about 30-40% of our revenue. And then banner ads actually heavily depends on how large your sessions are. So in hyper casual games, if you play like sort of 1 minute sessions and you play 5 to 10 minutes per day, banner ads are sort of not that big of an impact, so maybe 5 or 10% of your revenue. But if you have games where, like, let's say puzzle games or word games where people are playing like an hour a day, and if you have 10-second refresh rates, like you could really rack up like 100 impressions, 150 impressions, and then banner ads will then be a huge part of your revenue. 30-35% is possible as well. So there's been a lot of changes, and like and it's really testing and trying out all the networks and all the ad units.
So from the other side of the coin, Dylan, how have you seen the demand from brands and such and the matching with the different ad formats over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is, I mean, being on the network side, we're fortunate enough to work with all these different game developers, studios, and publishers. And I think the biggest thing, there's not a one-size-fits-all sort of strategy when it comes to including ads in your games, right? In its core, you need to really think about the core loop or mechanics of a certain game. So like what CK mentioned, sort of on the hyper-casual side, maybe an interstitial is more important to them than a banner or word video. And just a matter of like balancing all of those aspects. User experience comes into play as well. And I think a big saturation that we've seen in the market is a lot of networks are showing ads for competitive games, right? So that's something you need to consider as well. And I think the thing being on the brand side is that there's definitely a big push. I think it's definitely forthcoming a lot now as brands are sort of opening their eyes to, they're able to cast this wide net just because there's such a varied user base that play mobile games these days. So it's definitely exciting. It's an exciting time to be in the space for sure.
I'm going to ask the audience, how many of you are indie developers and you're here because you want to know how to maximize your ad revenue or how to maybe put it in your game in a better way? I'm just curious. Okay, got one. How many here just love ads so much and it's so cool and you want to know what everyone's doing? Look at that. Oh, it's like we're a tribe. Okay, excellent. And RV, for anyone who's not sure what that means, is rewarded video. I know sometimes when you come into a room and you're like, oh, what does that mean? And no one wants to ask that question. I'm going to ask it for you. So interesting you should say what an exciting time it is for brands. So when you talk to a brand, particularly now that we think about with Apple changing the rules on personalization and kind of tracking how much information, I know we talked about this earlier, how that was for you as a brand, and then we'll jump over to CW for a developer. Talk to us a little about, well, I'm going to go with CW first, I think, for this one. How did that affect your business? Because there was that, like, it's the apocalypse, it's over. How did that work for you guys?
Yeah. I'd say maybe a little bit like Y2K for people who've been around like longer. So like Y2K, like all the computers were supposed to stop working, and turned out fine. And so I'd say ATT. I'd say at the end of the day, everything turned out fine, but sort of more nuanced than that. I would say year over year, sort of iOS CPMS were flat, which typically is unusual. Usually CPMs go up, and so I would say if you consider that, I'd say it's maybe down 5 or 10%. And so all of the testing budget went to Android, and so Android sort of year over year CPMS went up more than expected, like more than it would normally go up. And so I'd say maybe. Android is up like 15-20%, where normally it's up 10% because the market is growing, and people are spending more on mobile, and the mobile space is growing. Whereas iOS would typically be up 10%, but it's sort of flat, and so you can consider that down 10%. But overall, like it's definitely not sort of what people was sort of all scared up and freaked out about. But it does make data analysis much harder. So now on the UA side, when we do data analysis, because there's a certain percentage of users that are not tractable, we then end up having to do correlations. So we actually now do a lot of data science and correlations on the UA side. So this channel, how much is it correlated to organic downloads and organic revenue? We end up having to do a lot of those things. Whereas before with deterministic tracking, you have a better sense. And so yeah, I would say overall, because we have a really strong brand, half of our users are actually organic. And yeah, on Twitter, on YouTube, and on TikTok, we work with influencers, and we have a lot of organic traffic, and we're pretty popular on those channels. And so it's been fortunate that yeah, we've been able to sort of weather through the AT&T sort of waves and be able to figure things out. But I think the whole industry is still learning, and I think it'll take some more time as everybody sort of adopts and fixes issues and things like that. Like Facebook is still fixing bugs, and so yeah, every channel is a little bit different on the UA side, on the monetization side, and there's definitely a lot of bugs that everybody's fixing. But overall, on the publisher side. Yeah, it's been more work. I think last year we updated 8 SDKs, an average of like 3 times each, like throughout the whole year. Starting from April. So it ended up being like a lot of like logistical like updates, and if you update to the wrong one, like it might crash and like things like that. But we're happy, sort of, or we're glad that phase is over, and then it's now sort of on the maybe server side, network side, on the adjusting their algorithms to optimize and run campaigns better and all of that. So yeah, at least on the publisher side, we're done with the sort of rocky SDK updates and updating ads.txts and updating a lot of p-lists and Android manifests and all of that. Which yeah, which actually is makes it more difficult for new indies, because there's more things now to make sure you get right. And with ATT pop-ups, like Apple will reject your app if you don't have the pop-up the way they want it, for example. And so a lot of those things you just have to have a checklist and make sure you do well and understand. But overall, like yeah, we're pretty optimistic about the industry.
Okay. And now, for Dylan, for you, like, walk us through a little about what happens or how you match brands with games or things like that, and what they're looking for as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is a shameless plug on HyprMX. I think the unique thing that we bring to the table is we are entirely brand focused. So we've been doing this for years, and we sort of understand the mechanics of what works and what doesn't work, for example, right? So rewarded video is like our bread and butter product. And the way that our campaigns monetize is on the completed ad view, right? So there's certain traits in-game where it makes sense to run a brand ad in your stack. It's sort of understanding that in-game ecosystem as well, right? Because you know, performance networks will pay top dollar to get sort of that first impression because that's the most valuable to them, right? They're looking for that install. For us, you know, the way we position ourselves is that, you know, there's a lot to be said about ad diversity, right? How many homescapes ad can you see until a user churns from your certain game? On top of that as well, it's just sort of a quality thing as well. You know, brands being aligned in-game, it has a certain feel element aspect to it where, you know, users are perhaps maybe more inclined to stay in-game. And something on the publisher side, too, that's worth noting is making it all sort of flow in your in-game economy, right? You don't want to give up. You want the in-game economy to be fair, but you don't want to give up too much. So as much as possible, I know IAP is a big revenue driver, but you need to step back and, you know, maybe think of advertising as a supplement as far as revenue goes, and sort of balancing that with the user experience and all of those components in-game.
Okay. We talked last week a little about how much time you should spend optimizing. You brought that up, optimization of your monetization through advertising's IAP. CW, from your side, we talked a little, I was kind of surprised, you kind of have a rule of thumb, how much time you would spend optimizing your ads versus just kind of seeing where they go from there.
Yeah, sure. We're fortunate, like we have a team to help optimize, and so we do spend a lot of time optimizing. We run a lot of A/B tests, and both Iron Source and Max as a mediation, they're great. They make it very easy for you to run A/B tests, and so we run a lot of those. I'd say like each game probably runs like one or two a week. Is sort of our cadence, and so really depends on like the size of your studio. I'd say for indie teams that are less than 5, like I would say just use one of the mediations, and then ask them for recommendations and just plug in top 6 to 7 networks, and you're going to be good to go, and you'll get 80% of the way there. If you want the last 20% of optimization and CPMs and ArtDAO, you're going to have to then run a lot of tests, and and it would be twice a week on each game. But you also need scale for that. Like I would say, if you're running these ads tests, then if it's interstitials, I would say you at least need like maybe 50,000 daily active users to make these waterfall placement A/B tests for it to be meaningful. And then if you're doing RV, you might need more. I'd say typical like opt-in rate for RV is like 3 to 1 versus interstitials, where it's forced on. So only like 30% of our users will engage with RV, and so then you might need like 150,000 daily active users for A/B tests to be meaningful and such. And so it really kind of depends on like how big your game is, how much extra ARPDAO sort of percentage you want to eke out. But I would say there's it's like a rabbit hole. Like you could keep digging and keep growing and all of that, which I think depends on your personality. It could be fun, or it could be like you don't want to work on that. And so I would say mid-sized teams like find people that love working on that. There are people that love ads. I think a lot of people raise their hands, and so luckily we have on our team like people that love working on ads, and they run a lot of these tests, and it actually is pretty cool when you see these tests and you get like a plus 10%, plus 15%. You're like, heck yeah, this is awesome. And like the impact of this downstream that will help you do more UA, help you monetize better, and all of that. And so basically you can spend as much time as you'd like. But if you want to get sort of like the initial like sort of 70-80% there, because you're a small team, 5 people, then I would say setting up the waterfall is maybe like 1 or 2 hours per game, like for first time. And if you've done it for a while, it's maybe like 20 minutes, half an hour to set up the waterfall. And so getting that initial setup, and you'll largely be fine until you grow UA and grow your user base a little bit more. So.
Great. So Dylan, do you help game developers that want to use the ad network? Do you help analyze their game and their design and make recommendations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the one thing that, working with someone like a CK or on the publisher side is communication is really important, making the partnership work. Like CK just mentioned, is testing is very important, and you sort of want to be aligned because not that a partnership's a marriage, but if you're going to put in the effort to talk to an ad provider, so you want to extract as much value as you can out of them. So certainly we do put on our consultative hats. A lot of partners are friendly enough to share sort of anonymized waterfall data, showing us like the breakout between having bidders in their stack and then running a hybrid waterfall system where the waterfalls sort of fall in place. And like CK had mentioned as well, these mediation tools are getting a lot more robust. So there's a lot of granular data that you could easily scrape and sort of exploit those certain things and squeeze out as much revenue opportunity as possible.
Great. When we What is the thing that you wish you had known starting out when you started working with advertising revenue and things like that? What do you wish you would have known that you maybe made some mistakes about, CK, that you were kind of like, oh, if I just gone this route instead, it would have saved me a lot of time, or a misconception I guess you had?
Yeah, yeah. There, there's like a gazillion of those, but maybe the very first one is 2014, 2015 was the first time we put ads in our games. And actually, prior to that, I was very, very against ads because I read this YC essay from Paul Graham, and he said that you want to build something a few people love, as opposed to something that a lot of people like. And so I really took that to heart. I said, okay, that means no ads. Like, I want people to love this, even if there's only like 100 users. That's better than like a billion users that people don't like and complain and all of that. So that's what we did for the first like 5, 6 years, 7 years of the company was really focus on what we thought was perfect and perfect for the user and keep it small. End of the day, you can't run a business with like 100 users, not usually, unless they're paying I don't know 6 digits per user. But and so yeah, I think the biggest thing coming from like a publisher that cares most about creating products and beautiful products that people want to use every day. And I myself grew up playing a ton of games, Warcraft, Starcraft, Dota. I'm like Diamond League, Masters League on Starcraft and such. And so like in Starcraft there's no ads, right? Like if after every game I'd pay ads, I'd be annoyed, right? So I get all of that, and I'd say that was probably our biggest sort of quote unquote mistake, or biggest opportunity cost loss over time. Had we started putting ads, 2011, like maybe it'd be a much larger company now, and maybe IPO'd already. So things like that like we've adjusted over the years, and we ran a lot of these A/B tests. Like you would think that like interstitial ads is going to hurt retention and all of that, and the truth actually with every test we've ran is most of the time it doesn't. It probably hurts retention for like a very specific cohort of users, and those are probably your IP whales. So for that cohort of users, like they don't want to see ads, they're perfectly fine paying thousands of dollars on Farmville and all of that. And so that's what you have to be careful about, and that's why there's some tools that like help you predict whether or not this user will be a paying user, and so maybe slow down the ads. Your first ad for these users. But when you run just sort of aggregate like A/B tests on whether or not to show interstitial ads, like all of the tests we've ran a dozen of these. They never hurt retention in aggregate because people understand if they're paying, they're playing for free and they never plan to spend money, they're okay watching ads, and if they don't want to watch ads, it's because they actually don't enjoy the game as much. But if if the game's really fun, they're actually really happy to watch ads, and for the people that don't, they will pay. And so that's probably our biggest sort of opportunity cost. That was like 5 years that like we're just like no ads. We don't like this experience. And I grew up playing games, didn't have ads in there, didn't want to do this. And we put our first interstitial ad in 2015. I remember it was our account manager at Google, Dimitri, that was like, no, CK, you don't understand how much money are leaving on the table, and he was like, oh, it's 7 digits. I'm like, really? Like, and so and so that's when we started our sort of ads journey. Then, yeah.
So Dylan, how about you? When you work with a developer, what common misconceptions do they have that you kind of have to walk them through about leaving those 7 digits on the table?
Exactly, yeah, and CK made good points on it. I think the biggest thing coming from the network side is sort of aligning expectations. CK might have one idea of like the sort of revenue increase he'll see by running HyprMX in his stack, but there's a lot to be said about timelines as well, right? A/B testing is something that he's spoken about very frequently. Seasonality is a big thing too, right? And you imagine Q4, not just us, but all networks are sort of dumping a bunch of spend. But then come the first week of January where things slow down, it's sort of like, aligning those expectations. Like, yes, our performance was great in December, just seasonally, something in January might not be the same. So it's just aligning those expectations and making a fruitful partnership, right? But again, it's the same thing. It's a marriage, but at the same time, like, you have to have difficult talks of, maybe, the state of the world right now, maybe on the ad side, it's definitely affected. And just the stuff going on out there. So expectation is a big thing. And another thing too is the data really doesn't lie. At the end of the day, these numbers are pulled. Someone like CK is looking at the numbers very frequently, he's testing frequently. And there are certain times where you have to pull the plug on certain providers or certain things in your game that aren't working. And that's sort of something you have to eat and sort of deal with and come up with a way to sort of recoup whatever revenue you lost or certain features in games, etc.
Interesting. Would you say, and this will be more, CK, you have a lot of games that are hyper casual or casual that probably attract a certain audience, probably a female audience. And for advertisers, I know I've talked before to people traditionally and then in the advertising space where they still sort of have this misconception that everyone who plays games are, young males. It's hard for people to understand that 50% of the games, and actually even more in the mobile space, is played by women. How, for you, Dylan, do you respond? Do you have people actively, like brands actively saying, I need to find this demographic, where are they? Or are you more like the matchmaker where you're like, you and you would be perfect together? How does that work?
It's a balance of both, right? So we rely on data from someone like CK. It's like, hey, generally, or even like the app Annie, that's not called app Annie now, but we rely on that app data. Like if a certain app skews female from 20 to 29, and we have an advertiser that's looking for that demographic, we'll point those campaigns to titles that skew in those sort of ways.
Mm-hmm.
We definitely have a lot of internal procedures put in place to sort of make that marriage happen. So. Yeah, and I think just being on the brand side too, again, I mentioned it earlier, brands are sort of opening their eyes. I think a lot of spend now is being shifted from traditional sort of avenues of like TV into mobile games. I think, with this whole Web3 blockchain stuff that, it's very early days, but, brands want to sort of be in there early because if they're not early, they're late, sort of thing.
Interesting. So you talked a little about the marriage where you guys work together with your ad company. Talk to me a little about how that relationship works, because I don't think people understand like how many different partnerships you can have. So CK, when you talk about the different advertising revenues that you use, are you using different agencies for each one, or how is that working for you? Like, how do you normally decide what that is?
Yeah, definitely. So we'll whichever network we work with, and for example with HyprMX, we'll ask them like, hey, which ad unit is strongest in your network, and it really depends. Like some networks, banner is the strongest, some it's RV, and like Dylan was saying, RV for them is huge, and then for some it's interstitials, and so we'll work with them and figure out what's the best ad unit, where should we start first, what are the typical sort of CPM placements. Those are pretty key for different geos, and maybe we'll pick sort of our top 5 geos and start there, and then release more geos later. And so just like Dylan was saying, we work very, very closely. My co-founder John actually does all the monetization side, and I do all the UA side. I think he has like weekly calls with our account managers from all of the the usual suspects, and so we definitely work really closely with them, take all the recommendations, and on the monetization side, it's really like a win-win sort of partnership, and and they're in it to grow revenue for you, because that's when they'll also create revenue for them. On the UA side, it's a little bit different, because like for them, like they might want you to spend more, but on your end you might need profitability benchmarks and all of that. But on the monetization side, it's very, very aligned in terms of like ultimate long-term goals and all of that. And so we work really closely with them and really take recommendations. And I'd say like maybe like quarterly there's like bigger changes for like seasonality parts. But by and large, like I would say, the initial setup is sort of most of the work. Yeah.
So you have three offices, right? Seattle, Philippines, and what was
Yeah,
the
Taiwan.
and Taiwan. And how many people do you have working at the company?
Yeah, we have 25 people here. We're in Bellevue, a little bit south of Crossroads, and then we have 80 in the Philippines, where I grew up. So one of my co-founders is there. I grew up there all my life. Moved there when I was 5, and then Taiwan, we have about 10 people, and that's where I was born. And so yeah, it's just places and people that I grew up and really care about the place, and then end up hiring there and working with friends there to start the studio. Um,
So,
and
so how many bodies do you have working that is just working on the monetization side of it? Like really looking at the magic data and being like, let's tweak this game has to be at this level. Like how many, because I'm thinking of an indie developer that's like, you're doing it all on your own. Like you've got, like, how do I do this? It might feel a little overwhelming. So I was just kind of wondering how many bodies you have.
yeah. Again, I think for indies they can totally do this, and then the way to do it is using ad mediation. Set up like the standard waterfall, and then leave it there first until you get like 100,000 DAU and more. But for us, like I would say on the ad monetization side, we have like one person that does QA. And so that's like making sure all the creatives are appropriate, and brands that we want to show in our games. So that ends up being like a big chunk of it. I would say on the optimization side and working with our partners, yeah, I would say we have 2 people on that. And then on the engineering side, I would say we have like 1.5.
Okay.
Um, yeah. So I guess that's around like 5 for our size. So like 5% of our headcount is on ad monetization. Um, yeah. But again, for indies, again, totally possible. You don't have to have 5 full-time people working on it. I would say again, that 5 full-time will get you an extra 20%, but you can get the first 80 very, very easily, just by yourself and a couple hours to figure this out. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. I encourage anybody, CK is speaking later on today. What time are you speaking?
I think it's like 3 or yeah, 3
I put
or
him on the
4.
spot.
3.
And he'll go more into detail if you really want to go into stuff. He can really answer some great questions for that. I'm going to open it up. We've got 10 minutes left, and I'd really like to open up to Q&A. I want to make sure everybody has time to ask any questions you might have. I should have brought candy to like throw at people to encourage you to step up and ask the questions. But does anybody have any questions for 2 very smart people ahead of their class that know all there is to know? This is the time. Don't be shy. There is no stupid questions. If you want to know it, ask it. So, yes, sir, in the back.
What about the Google Sandbox? What are you guys thinking there? Like, is it going to be a really protracted rollout according to Google? But I'd like to know what you guys are taking learnings from iOS 14 and how you're applying that to Google, and what you guys think is going to happen there.
Yeah, so I don't think there's a ton of details, and maybe like purposely so from their side. But we're still trying to understand how to do everything, and I think it'll be similar in terms of like communications with our MMPs, with our ad networks, and figuring out what they have, which SDKs we should use and which SDKs we shouldn't use, and all of that. So in terms of communications, I think it's gonna look very, very similar as ATT. Updating ads, TXTs, updating SDKs, figuring out like yeah, what we need to do in certain Android OSs. I think it was supposed to be iOS 12, but now it's like pushed to 13. And typically Android OS's life cycle, they sort of come up slower. It's not like iOS where like literally when Apple turns it on, like maybe in like 3 weeks they have 70% of devices. And so Apple had to purposely slow the rollout of ATT, and we're very thankful about that. I think the whole industry is thankful on like what happened there. We love Apple and Google. And so, yeah, I think, yeah. So anyway, so there's not a lot of visibility into what exactly they're doing. Hopefully, they're still deciding, and they'll postpone for another year, and that's kind of like our fingers crossed. Yeah, but I think at the end of the day, like as developers, actually, we just update SDKs and do whatever MMPs and ad networks tell us. Like there's not sort of much more beyond that. So it's mostly coordinating, and then hopefully it's not like hot fixes where it's like this needs to get out today. Like hopefully we have a little bit more lead time. But yeah, it's just really working with our partners and working with them closely to figure this out. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Um, all these ad formats, you've talked about RV. What about RA? What about rewarded audio?
Yeah, that's something I did want to bring up too, sort of exploring alternate ad formats. I think that's sort of come up, like in London at the Pocket Gamer event we were at earlier this year. There are a few ad formats that do come to mind that are sort of the new, latest, and greatest that people want to jump on. So the first being sort of that in-game native experience, like say a billboard, for example, in-game is something that it's rumblings of. I know there are a great set of service providers doing it. On our end, it seems very early days, and it takes time to really build these things out. And then on top of that, too, you'd mentioned audio ads. That's something we're also exploring as well. I think with this sort of renaissance of podcasts now, it's funny because you think of audio as like traditional radio and stuff, which is sort of an outdated sort of medium these days. But incorporating that in game could be powerful, right? Making sure it makes sense in sort of a rewarded placement or however you place it in. Again, that is also very early days. So yeah, those two formats definitely come to mind. And then I think a big thing too is just sort of even getting more granular beyond sort of reward video, interstitial, those standard stuff is like custom brand integrations, right? Is having brands in game, surface as like an icon in game as well. It's sort of having those discussions with the brands directly or the agencies on record that represent those brands, and sort of finding creative and unique ways to incorporate those brand elements in a way in the game where it feels natural and it's sort of a good fit.
Yeah, that's an excellent question about what new ad formats are coming out that you have an eye for and looking at. And for CK, what does it take in a new format to make you be like, is this worth it to do all the work behind it to put it, like you've got your, this works for us, and then this is the future, what bandwagon do we have to jump on?
Yeah, definitely. This one, unfortunately, we're like kind of like a lagging sort of party in terms of testing out new ad formats. Yeah, I think we're still pretty conservative on the user experience side, and so testing ad units, we follow it really closely. And so the one that I'm most excited, I think Dylan mentioned as well, is in-game ads. And so seeing like in-game billboard ads and then in-game icons and all of that. That's what we're most excited about because hopefully like it's sort of more passive and not like sort of not intrusive at all. But that one we're following really closely, and we've seen some games in the market that have this from Voodoo, for example. And so we're sort of looking at that and looking at the integrations. Those like it's like a lot of custom integration because every game is different. So do you put it on a building or do you put it on the floor? Do you put it on your character? Like it's just sort of like everywhere. And so we're waiting to see sort of how that plays out. But I'd say in-game ads is probably the ad unit that we're most excited about. And then I think sort of everything else, like we've heard like lock screen ads and all of that, we're sort of on the lagging sort of party, and we sort of wait and see and make sure like people like it, and we'll do a lot of tests. Just like when we started doing interstitial ads, we did a dozen A/B tests, and then figure out. And there's also like app launch screen ads and such. So there's definitely a lot of ad units, and we're all on the sort of wait and see and study approach. So
Great. Question? Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
one last question. CK, you said so you're monetizing with in-app ads primarily. Are you finding where you buy in-app offer wall, rewarded video, wherever it may be? Are you finding that the channels you monetize with are where you're seeing the most success from a user acquisition channel perspective, or where's the sweet spot for you?
yeah. So it's like depends on game and then platform and then channel. But I'd say like we have some channels where we buy UA a lot and then monetize really, really well. But then there are some channels where we only do UA and monetization is not that big, and then also vice versa. And then net, I would say like we do much more monetization than we do UA. And half of our traffic is organic and all of that. So we have more cases of channels where we monetize really well, and it's like one of our top share voice, like top 3, top 4. But yeah, on the UA side, we haven't been able to take off. So we have more of those than sort of the other way around. But some channels like I would say Google, for example, is like one that is like win on both, and because of their large scale and everything. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? Excellent.
You were talking about not having checked out, that you being excited about in-game ads and not having checked out quite a lot of them yet. Is it a reluctance to get involved with more SDKs, integrating more SDKs, and what and what could you say to indie developers about dealing with that SDK creep kind of thing that is happening?
Yeah. It's definitely the SDK creep, and then also I think there is somewhat of an aversion. Our team, all of them play games, all of them love games, and when I ask them about SDKs, they're like, oh yeah. But when I talk about the next new live event or the next new skin that we're releasing, next new character, next new level, like they're super excited about that. So for some reason, like they code that much faster, and we end up releasing game features much faster than we release SDK updates. And so, I think as a company, we just execute much faster. And for us, like, our big goal this year and sort of Q1 next year is to release user-generated content. And so that's really sort of where our number one focus is, and really figuring out that piece. How can we help, content creators create more content inside our games? And so, so on the ad side, sort of testing wise, we're definitely not doing as much versus sort of like building more of our in-game economy, releasing more skins and all of that. So and then I'd say for indie, that's also still the right focus until you get to higher DAU count and all of that. Then you can start getting more help on the monetization side. Maybe start with finding consultants that can help guide you and help. Some of them actually even help do it for you. And so, finding the right people and partnering with them is definitely the way to go on the indie scale. And always product first, because at the end of the day, your customers are coming to play your games, right?
So let's have you guys both close up with maybe closing thoughts on the topic today. We're down to 3 minutes, so I'll let Dylan start. Throw some wisdom at the group.
Yeah, just test early, test often. Don't just because you have a bad experience one time, test again a few months later and sort of see if it sticks. Then not to work with a certain provider or certain mechanic in the game. Testing again, I mentioned earlier, the data doesn't lie. So if you're a big data-driven person, that's something to keep in mind as well. And then the last thing is user experience. CK had mentioned sort of balancing, like a little bit of everything. Is showing too many ads, maybe frequency capping ads. Depending on how your team is incentivized, right? Maybe their dev team is more incentivized for new skins and new features versus adding in another SDK where they're not going to see that much value, or who knows, maybe they'll see a lot of value. So people are incentivized differently. It's just a matter of testing, everything being open, and just keeping an open mind.
Great. How about you, CK?
Yeah, I would say also echoing that, as an indie, just start off making fun games and then put ads in early and don't be afraid that like, oh, it's going to kill the user experience and all of that. As an indie, you're going to have to figure out how to make a fun game that has ads, as opposed to how do I make a fun game with no ads, no in-app purchase, nothing. And so, putting it early and then like Dylan's saying, testing as well. And then, just setting up, like a standard waterfall, maybe 3 placements from each channel and, 30, 20, 10, and just running with that, and you'll get sort of 70-80% of the way there, and then focus really on the game and how to make a fun game that has ads. Because making a fun game that has no ads and no in-app purchase, it's not sustainable. But just in-app purchase is actually really, really hard. I'll talk a bit more in my afternoon talk about why that's hard. But I think as an indie, you're gonna have to figure out how to make a fun game that has ads. So.
Excellent. Any further questions? All right, this concludes our session today. Thank you so much for sharing the afternoon with us.